This is the Tom Anderson Show, broadcasting live from the KVNT studios, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday.
Well, if you're a fan of military books and novels, particularly nonfiction, Jerome Preisler's your man. He's a military historian, thriller writer, author of the best-selling Net Force series, co-created by Tom Clancy. And he's lectured across the nation on military topics and such. Books like All Hands Down, The True Story of the Soviet Attack on the USS Scorpion, or Codename Caesar, and that was the secret hunt for the U-boat 864 during World War II. He's written a new book about, some call him the Jack Ryan of the Civil War, War Commando, William Cushing and the daring raid to sink the ironclad CSS Albemarle. Good morning, Mr. Preisler. How are you, and how goes the battle as you continue to write books? I don't know how you get it all done and have so many in so short of time.
Well, I guess I'd say quarantine helps, but as a writer, I've been ahead of the curve on that. So I don't know. I guess that's just what I do. Good morning to you, and thanks for the great intro.
Absolutely. Well, I watched on 60 Minutes just last week, gave me goosebumps, the overview of Ken Burns. And you have a lot of similarities to Ken Burns, where you, as an author, want to highlight nuances, aspects, details that many of us may not have understood or known. And it's so insightful, not just for students and for scholarship, but for those that want to remember. And so I see parallels here. And in Ken Burns' case, he said one of my next agendas is the American Revolutionary War. He covered World War II and, of course, the Civil War. And in your case, you're very parallel. You've covered World War II, and you've covered, different phases of warfare. Civil War is a biggie and probably difficult to research as easy as a more modern war. So what drew you to William Cushing's story, and what made you decide to write about him specifically versus his brother, who was also a hero?
Well, his brother actually would be a great subject for a book, but I like characters who kind of go through a certain trajectory in their lives, especially military characters. Which is to say that Will started out as somebody who was booted out of the Naval Academy, who was insubordinate, who was hot-tempered, and not somebody that anyone projected to be any sort of hero. In fact, as I said, he was booted out of the Naval Academy and almost didn't get into the Navy. So the fascinating thing about somebody like that is you see him starting out at one end, and then you go to the other end of the arc, and he becomes this heroic figure, and therefore there's always a story there, and there's a journey. And so, like any kind of great character, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, there's a great appeal there because you've got some meat to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you call William Cushing a Civil War commando?
Will was very successful at launching commando-type raids using small forces against large targets. And by large targets, I mean both larger fighting ships or larger troop contingents. So, he would regularly lead a group of 12, 15 men ashore against a town full of Confederate troops. And he was just brave / crazy enough to think he could pull off these missions, and he did. That's first aspect to it. The second is that in his attack against the CSS Albemarle, which is obviously part of the title or the subtitle of the book, which was a huge Confederate ironclad warship, Will not only launch just that sort of a raid, an attack, but used what at that time was an advanced technology in order to pull it off. And that again was very, very kind of it really was a predecessor. That's not the right word, but of later SEAL type tactics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And by the way, the CSS Albemarle, folks, was a steam-powered ironclad gunboat. I mean, the Confederate Navy used this and wiped out so many of the Union's vessels, and it was thought to be impermeable. It wasn't, of course, and that's what this book's all about. I mean, you're talking about almost 160 feet in length. It was, propulsion was by steam, but what I was fascinated with was 120-mile range. It could go 4 knots. We're talking like almost 5 miles an hour. It seems slow, but I mean, when you've got a juggernaut like that, and the biggest deal, its complement was like 150 officers and men. I had no idea, but what's cooler is what you just addressed, which is this method of warfare, the spar torpedo. What was that? I know what it is, but for people that don't understand how complicated it was for Cushing and team, these commandos of the time, to come at this ironclad vessel, how did that work?
Well, let's start off with the actual vessel that Will used, and that was a 30-foot long launch, or they called it a picket boat, which picket meaning a sentinel boat or a sentry boat. So it only accommodated a crew of about 13, 14 men. The spar torpedo that you refer to put that in context, nowadays we think of torpedo in terms of something that's carried by a submarine, and it's got rocket propulsion and it shoots through the water. That's not what a torpedo was in the Civil War. A closer equivalent would be a mine. It didn't shoot anywhere. It was an explosive warhead. So what they did was they attached it to a spar, which is a long wooden pole. Spars were typically used, and people are more familiar with the term in terms of sails on sailing ships are lifted up and down spars or masts. But this was so you had the mine mounted at the end of the spar, and the whole thing, the whole contraption, rigged to the front of this little 30-foot launch. But there was another key element that made it very innovative. Because the ironclad that you so aptly described a moment ago was completely covered with iron plating for the most part, they needed to find a vulnerability, and that vulnerability was an area which typically was right at or below the waterline, where the wooden underpinnings of the Albemarle met that iron armor. That was where it had to be hit, because if Will would have hit it with the spar torpedo at the point where it was armored, it probably wouldn't have done anything. What Will did was create this fairly complicated rig, which enabled him to raise and lower the spar so that as he approached the ironclad, and mind you, he's being fired at from two shores as well as from the ironclad itself. So these are snap decisions he has to make. He needs, at night, to target the precise area and the precise height above the water where he can hit the wooden Achilles heel, so to speak, and quickly lower that spar torpedo so that it hits it at the right time. And because the torpedo wasn't fired, it was part of his little launch over there, he then had a hope that he didn't blow up with it.
Yeah, well, and we can get into what happened. We're talking with Jerome Preisler. His book is Civil War Commando. By the way, we'll get into this when we come back, but the fact that it's really fascinating how these vessels were defended with like floating log booms, think of logs, and they're in the water, and they start getting slimy, and suddenly they're not protecting the vessel, if anything, they're a launch. If you're coming at it, you can slime right up into it. And that's exactly what Will Cushing did. Then it blows up ultimately. And Mr. Preisler, Jerome will tell us what happened. It wasn't all good. We lost some men there. We're going to come right back. The name of the book, Civil War Commando. And I'll tell you how you can purchase it by Jerome Preisler. Stay with us. Tom Anderson Show.
This is the Tom Anderson Show. Broadcasting live from the KVNT studios, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday.
Jerome Preisler's book, Civil War Commando, gives us some insight on heroes of that day and that era, William Cushing being one, his daring raid to sink the ironclad CSS Albemarle. And we were talking about how it was so difficult to not just pierce the iron literally, but to get to a vessel so well guarded like that. Once Will and his commando team did, then the explosives went off and we left it there. And I wanted to come back to Jerome and find out what ultimately happened. I think it's a good ending or you wouldn't have written the book. And were there casualties, which I know there were, sadly.
Yeah, and actually, in the moments before Will struck the Albemarle with the spar torpedo, he yelled for his men to really not abandon ship, because it's a ship, it was a small boat. So they just dove in the water, trying to swim for their lives. Will was about the last man aboard, and then as the torpedo struck, he leaped off into the water. This was October. The water was cold. It was a rainy, misty night, and he's now swimming blindly, trying to find shore, along with the other men. A lot of them were picked off. Will is trying to find the shore, he comes upon another one of his crewmen who's struggling to swim in the water. He doesn't know how to swim, or he's in too much of a panic. So Will tries to help him along and swims along with him towards shore for as long as he can. But ultimately, the guy goes under, and Will has to let go of him.
And this is muddy water, right? I mean, this is muddy water. That's why when the vessel blew up and ultimately sank, I mean, it went into mud and it was like 6 feet of water, I recall. But that doesn't, you're not going to walk out. You're going to have to swim, and you're going to have to swim expeditiously. And when you say picked off, people are getting shot at and they're getting captured. People forget that. The prisoners of war, we go on with our lives, but someone suffered.
Right, and the conditions in which they were in prison were really god awful. So yeah, that's true. And when Will finally makes it to shore, he's now on enemy turf. He doesn't really know exactly which way to go. He hides in fields. He hides in the woods, and this goes on for about 6-7 hours. Finally, around daylight, he runs into a slave. And mind you, again, that Will doesn't really know that he succeeded in sinking the Albemarle. He knows that he struck it. He knows that there was an explosion, but he didn't stick around long enough to see whether the Albemarle actually went down. The slave is the one who tells him about the Albemarle sinking. So that's the first time he knows that his mission was successful and that the loss of all these men was not in vain.
People are going to buy this book that are interested in history. You're going to see a lot of veterans purchasing this book. They can go, by the way, to Regnery.com and get more information, RegneryHistory.com, and you can look up the book. It has an awesome cover. And Jerome Preisler, I encourage you to look at his other books. By the way, he has his own website where you can locate them. The same. When you go and you lecture at universities, when you see bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young students, I don't care if it's high school, college, or professors listening, do they find insight in this? I mean, is there a nexus to naval warfare? This must have helped in the later years, the late 1800s and beyond, and gave some insight on how to attack other vessels until, of course, we modernized. What was this put in? Not your book, but I mean, what William Cushing did, was this used as an example thereafter for military, particularly sea warfare?
Yeah, in fact, after the mission, Admiral Farragut, who was the position of Admiral of the Navy was created for him, called Will Cushing the hero of the Civil War. And that was because the tactics that he used, not only against the Albemarle, but in his throughout his career, launching different expeditions and raids, were models for naval warfare to follow. Something I'd like to mention is that Will was only about 20 years old when he conducted his mission against the Albemarle. The larger portion of his naval career happened when he was between the ages of 18 and 20. So this is an audacious, daring young man who's setting precedent in terms of the kind of tactics he's using against the enemy. And yeah, absolutely, it does inform what happened later. And it's a great yarn. I think that's kind of the key to what I like to, the way I like to approach both talking about history, whether I'm speaking to people at a library or a school, or writing about it, which is just to make it try to bring you into it and make it exciting.
Well, and William Cushing, I noticed that he at one point rubbed elbows with George Dewey, and I don't know if that was as students or as Navy men or both, but then, of course, Dewey later, the Battle of Manila Bay and some of those great stories, I'm saddened to think William Cushing could have been right there with him as a Commodore, as a fleet commander, who knows, but his demise was so often is the case early, and I know he had back injuries, and he might have had tuberculosis of the hip, all sorts of yucky stuff that back then, morphine may hide the pain, but the malady's still there, and you succumb to it. We're talking with Jerome Preisler. Again, his book is Civil War Commando, and I think it's a must read. And if any of you ladies out there, men out there, either want to read it yourselves or get it as a gift, you can help Jerome out because he's working his butt off writing these books. And there's not big money in it if people don't buy the books. And I'm going to get it, and I know my dad and I will enjoy it for sure. Now, as a novelist, you've worked with Tom Clancy. That's a big deal. And do you find that there is the difference between writing nonfiction versus like thrillers? I'm sure there is. It's much more complicated with a nonfiction to research.
Well, yes and no. The thing about a thriller is that when you get your hero into a fix, you can make up a way for him to get out of it. You can't do that with history because history is history. It happened. The two kind of cornerstones of the way I write are, which really grew out of my working with Tom, are factual accuracy and telling a good, exciting story. Those apply to writing a novel, at least of the Tom Clancy sort of novel, where you really need to get your information right and you need to do a lot of research, or whether it's nonfiction like Civil War Commando, where again you need to do your research, you need to get everything right, but you also need to make it entertaining and thrilling. So I really apply the same skill set. That's my approach to nonfiction. But again, the biggest difference is that you're bound by the facts, and I don't say that as a negative. I mean, obviously, that's why you're writing. That's why you're writing a nonfiction. With a novel, you're not.
Agreed. I'm excited to see sales skyrocket on this one if people have any interest in military and history. His name is Jerome Preisler. You can purchase this book at regneryhistory.com, or you can go to Jerome Preisler online and you can look up his other books. You can do both, I'd recommend. The name of the book is Civil War Commando. He was the Jack Ryan of the Civil War. William Cushing and the daring raid to sink the ironclad CSS Albemarle. And what a story it is. Jerome, I appreciate it. We look forward to more books, and I'd love to interview you again. Keep them coming, okay?
Oh, thanks so much, Tom. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And folks, you can watch this on YouTube, the Tom Anderson Show channel. A video will be made today. And then if you go in the comment section, you can look and see the links to Regnery and to Mr. Preisler's website, and you can purchase the books. And I'd recommend you do that for Christmas. Perfect timing. Get them sent to you and dole them out. We're going to come right back, my friends. It's the Tom Anderson Show. Good morning.